civil servants being targeted, journalists being targeted, politicians being targeted, and lots of things like cyber attacks. And it's not just in the UK, it's a huge issue in wider Europe, in places like Germany at the moment. And it's definitely something which we're going to see more and more of, especially in such a huge election year.
We're a week away from local elections and several major, actually, national announcements from both the main party this week. You'll remember that the Conservatives committed to spending 2.5% of national income on defence. The Labour Party set out their stall for overhauling train travel. How much of this will sort of shift the dial when it comes to local elections? And then, of course, we've got that turbulence in Scotland. But first of all, something that is concerning all parties, and it's the story that makes the front page of the Times this morning, is about Chinese influence in our society. Talk TV's correspondent Victoria Innes is with us. Victoria, good morning.
Good morning.
Now, there's been a review, really, by our secret services into our higher education. And the warning, really, is that hostile states are targeting universities to do things like steal their tech. Just tell us, what is it that the government's concerned about?
Well, it's exactly like you say. Look, we know that in our British universities, there is a lot of cutting edge science which goes on, especially in areas like you talked a bit this morning about AI, robotics, quantum science, all of those things. And they're worried essentially that countries like China, which we know recently has been targeting the UK and wider Europe, they've targeted politicians, they've targeted civil servants, journalists. Very recently, a parliamentary researcher was charged with spying for China and handing over information. And he, of course, had links to very senior politicians, including the security minister. And so MI5, like you say, has conducted this review into these vulnerabilities within our higher education system. And this is where this information comes from. It's essentially a warning of what they've called academic espionage, whereby sensitive research of these institutions could be targeted and stolen, and is especially acute within our universities because many of them have foreign ties. They collaborate quite closely with other countries. And so these are vulnerabilities which could be exploited. They rely, some of them, on income from countries like China. And so this report is all about getting that balance right, balancing the need to remain open to collaboration, but also the need to protect national and university interests and that sensitive information.
It really then puts the pressure on the government to come up with better, more effective strategies to protect against Chinese, specifically Chinese espionage. How are they trying to do that?
Well, today is all about this sort of new vetting system so that anyone that has access, anyone that works in those areas can access sensitive research information, will be properly background checked to make sure that there are no potential concerns there. That also require universities to consult with the security services when they're entering into those funding partnerships, those collaborations with foreign institutions that I mentioned. Now, there's already an advice team which sort of links between university staff and the security services, but this wants to be expanded even further, and it will look at things like those research collaborations, especially in those critical areas which I mentioned, like AI, like robotics, like quantum science.
I mean, MI5 cannot state more seriously how serious they think this is. They said the most game-changing challenge it faces coming from increasingly authoritarian Chinese Communist Party that is targeting industrial secrets and intellectual property in the West. I mean, there's that challenge and sort of new measures that you've just described, Victoria, being put in place into our high universities. But you've said, Parliament itself, the people who work in there have been, as we've discovered so recently, successfully infiltrated by those spying for China.
Yeah, exactly. And, it is a big concern, and it's been in the news a lot recently. We've heard huge amounts of information ranging from, like I say, civil servants being targeted, journalists being targeted, politicians being targeted, and lots of things like cyber attacks. And it's not just in the UK, it's a huge issue in wider Europe, in places like Germany at the moment. And it's definitely something which we're going to see more and more of, especially in such a huge election year.
Well, let's talk about the election year, of course, in the States, but here in England, local elections are just a week away. Nationally, both parties well, Labour and the Conservatives are significantly ramping up their promises, their pledges. Of course, this is in view of the general election that is looming at some point later on this year. What have we learnt this week? Because there's been some pretty hefty policy announcements from both parties.
Yes, 1 week away and it's full steam ahead, as you say. And on both sides, there's lots of policy championing and into that final push next week. Now, obviously, Rishi Sunak, the Conservatives this week, he's been in Europe. He's been promising a huge chunk more aid and support for Ukraine, everything from, armored vehicles, air defense missiles, ammunition. He's also promised to increase Britain's defense spending to hit that 2.5% target by 2030 in light of all these major conflicts and security threats that are going on globally. And he says he's going to put the UK's defence industry on a war footing, which he's hoping, of course, that's going to be a vote winner. They've also got things like the final passing of the Rwanda Bill, which he's hoping also will put him ahead of Labour on that. Now, Labour promising to renationalise rail services within 5 years if it wins the next election. Keir Starmer saying privatisation hasn't worked. It's been a complete mess. There's an inefficiency of the current system, which means that everyone has been affected by cancellations and delays, things that, a lot of us have experienced. And they're saying they won't shy away from that. So Labour's hoping that that is going to be a policy which is going to resonate with people, and we'll find out really next week if it has. And overall, it's worth saying at this point that latest predictions from those experts suggesting that the Tories are on course to lose as many as 400 seats, and Labour equally could be squeezed by those left-wing and independent parties. So there really is all to play for.
Yeah, the one big question, particularly for the Conservatives, is could any sort of significant progress with the Rwanda Bill shift the dial significantly? The Times is reporting this morning, though, that there's a sort of secondary knock-on effect problem to the policy, and that is that asylum seekers in the UK are leaving to go to Ireland because they're fearful of being deported. What's happening?
Yeah, this is a really interesting claim from Ireland's Foreign Minister, Micheál Martin. And he's basically highlighting that, given the fact that anyone can cross that Northern Irish border without any document checks, that more and more asylum seekers have been doing just that since the Rwanda policy was announced. He called it a knee-jerk reaction and labelled it a failure of Brexit. And he said it was having a huge impact on Ireland. Whether that's true or not at this stage, we don't know. But it comes in the context of, French President Emmanuel Macron also appearing to take aim at the policy. And the bottom line, I think, is that the Rwanda deportation bill is now law. Downing Street says it's identified the first cohort of people to send there. The first flight has been booked. And so everyone, like you say, will be watching to see when that happens and ultimately whether it's that deterrent that they hoped it would be.
Yeah, and whether we're creating a secondary problem there. Final thing we should mention, and we've got a little bit more on this in detail in about half an hour's time on the programme, but in Scotland, I mean, yesterday was so dramatic. Humza Yousaf kind of got his elbows out first in front of the Greens, of which he had this, what was quite fractious in the last few weeks, coalition with. Now he's facing this vote of no confidence. I mean, how secure do you think his position is?
Yeah, it was really interesting, wasn't it? And I think we could very well find out the answer to that question next week when it's likely, he'll face this no confidence vote, given that he is now in charge of that minority government. And so I think the question will be, are members of his own party starting to doubt him, or will they get behind him? And what could he do about it if they are? Now, the Scottish Conservatives obviously brought that no confidence vote. The Greens say they'll support it, Scottish Labour too, and Sawa, saying he has no confidence in Humza Yousaf and no confidence in the government. And if the majority of SNP MSPs vote against him, he will be expected to resign. But the caveat is that he doesn't have to. And a lot of this analysis seems to be surrounding that one former SNP minister who defected to the Alba party, who could end up very well having that decisive vote. But I think for Humza Yousaf, he's putting on a brave face. He seems confident. He told a press conference yesterday that his decision to end that coalition showed that he was in a strong position. And he said, this is leadership. This is the ability to say we are taking control as a party and as a government. So the question will be, are those just words or do people really believe it? And we may well find out as soon as next week.
Exactly. Victoria, thank you very much. A very comprehensive overview of what's happening really in all corners of the United Kingdom today, from Scottish politics, what's happening with the Rwanda Bill and, of course, policy promises as we loom and head towards those local elections in England. Victoria, thank you so much.